I've never been in front of like a real Van Gogh or a real Seurat before, and it was just mind-blowing.
Kind of surreal.
Surreal?
Kind of a surreal experience.
I only cried twice.
Taking your breath away.
It feels like you're actually walking through the paintings.
It makes me feel like I'm on that timeline in the 1800s.
You can see that texture.
Textures and colors.
The colors are just so amazing. It's just beautiful.
It shows you how little shapes can make big things.
I give the exhibit 3 thumbs up.
Definitely, it's a don't miss.
Hello and good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and enjoying kind of the cool air as I am if you just came into the museum. So it's wonderful to have you all here with us today. My name is Emily Fry, and I'm the Executive Director of Interpretation at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'm thrilled that you're joining us today to learn about Impressionism throughout our collection from one of our esteemed colleagues. The video that you just saw was created by Shelowyn Schuert, who is a McMullen Arts Leadership intern and a rising fifth year at Northwestern University. She's pursuing a dual bachelor's degree in radio, television, and film and electrical engineering. She's currently working within our experience design department in digital content. So thank you, Chelly, for highlighting our audience's enthusiastic response to this very special exhibition. As we begin, just a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Sam Ramos. Sam is the Director of Gallery Activation at the museum and has been with the Art Institute since 2017. If you've attended a daily gallery tour or any of our in-gallery programming, you probably have had him as a guide. He's such an impactful educator and has set the stage for innovative teaching within the collection. And I get to work with him, and he's just great. Outside of his time at the museum, Sam writes fiction, essays, and art criticism. He's published several pieces, including I'll just name a few titles: Exiles from the Wasteland, An Invisible System, The Art of Chef Weems, our article, What Relevance Can Art Have for Frontline Providers Right Now? That was in Hyperallergic in 2020. And On Leaving Dove Springs, a meditation on neighborhood fear, family, and change. His novel, La Gloria, was included on the Zank Prize for Fiction Longlist in November of 2018. And Sam has his master's in fine arts and creative writing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So thank you for being here today. And now please join me in welcoming Sam to the stage.
Hello, everyone. You didn't have to say that, but I appreciate it. So, this is recognized as the first photograph of a human being ever made. It was created in 1838 by photographer and painter Louis-Jacques Manet Daguerre. It is a view of the Boulevard du Temple in Paris. The exposure time for this photo was approximately 8 hours. You can see the shadow of a person here having their shoes shined. You can also subtly distinguish the shadow of the boot black. I've looked closely at the image in hopes of discovering more figures. Surely someone else on this busy street would have also stopped long enough for Daguerre to capture their form on the silver-plated sheet of copper that would result. I like to think that maybe I've found a pair of feet over here, or maybe the hint of a hunched person over here, but that may just be wishful thinking. In any event, this figure is clear. When we talk about Impressionism, we have to talk about modernity. In his 1860 book, The Painter of Modern Life, French poet and essayist Charles Baudelaire describes modernity as, quote, the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent, that half of art of which the other is the eternal and immutable, end quote. He is writing about modernity in the context of art, modernity as a creative response to contemporary life and culture. Every old master, he writes, possessed his own modernity. The vast majority of fine paintings left to us by former generations are clothed in the costumes of their era. Even Rembrandt, he seems to be saying, can be considered modern because Rembrandt's subjects represent the fashions and character of that day, even if the themes are eternal. The modern artist is a person of their time. However, the modern artist also looks both forward and backward. Photography was invented in France in the 1830s and was soon popularized. The medium went through multiple technological innovations, resulting in an ever more dramatic, accessible, affordable, and flexible image-making process. Presidents and crowned heads had their photographic portraits taken. Battlefields were documented. Artists and actors were immortalized. Perhaps most profoundly, the everyday person could eventually have their portrait taken, whereas previously, the traditional magnificent oil portrait was the domain of the well-heeled. Now, portraiture could belong to the people in the way it never had before. Anyone could stand awkwardly in front of a camera and wait the 30 to 40 seconds to make an image that they could look at later and say, is that really what I look like? Immortality is a lot to ask of an image, any image. So let us be clear, to my knowledge, there is no immortal image. We have an entire department of conservation dedicated to the stalling of time. But even they, and perhaps especially they, will admit that it is ultimately a losing battle. Every painting and sculpture will eventually give way to time. But be that as it may, for all intents and purposes, once your portrait is made, assuming it will be basically taken care of, it has every chance of outliving you and outliving your children and grandchildren for generations to come. It has, for centuries, been a unique power of art to capture what is visible, tangible, and lived through the illusion of material and technique, and to transfer to whatever is captured the weight of significance and meaning. So what does it mean when a generation of artists is forced to not only come to terms with the character of their own time, but to respond in the face of new technology, lauded for being able to do exactly what those artists have been trained and paid to do for centuries? In this case, make images. And even worse, when the technology, photography, can do it even better. This is a painting by Dutch artist Eduard Manet, painted in 1662. The title's unwieldy: a vanitas still life with a flag, candlestick, musical instruments, books, writing paraphernalia, globes, and hourglass. Collier painted in an era when an artist was expected to be a maestro of detail. As with 19th century painters, 17th century painters were responding to a shift in technology. In Collier's case, this included the use of oil paint, a technique which had taken hold approximately 2 centuries before, and which had provided for artists the ability to capture reality with exquisite detail, a mimicry of life that was uncanny and which was prized. Collier hasn't only included books in this still life, he's included full pages of text, individual words, and replicated images. He's included musical notation, various woods, metals, fabrics. Collier was a painter, like many others across Europe, who learned skills passed down through generations that allowed him to do what the eye could not, what no other existing technology could do. A painting like this one was the closest a person could come to the visual experience of reality beyond the reality itself. This is Claude Monet's Apples and Grapes, painted in 1880, over 200 years after the Collier. Fruits scattered over a rumpled tablecloth. Each aspect of this still life is formed with and by color. The apple, just to the left of center, is a swirling of whites, reds, and blues. The outlines of the apple are fuzzy, blended, and not blended with the shadows, tablecloth, and adjacent fruit. The bunch of grapes here is even more pronounced in this way, as Monet veers this side of legibility, dabbed and smeared applications of paint, just articulating one grape from another. There is something exciting about a sphere, at least the way Monet does it here, something provocative. This basket or bowl, hard to tell confidently which, holding bunches of fruit, is a hodgepodge, a cacophony. It's a miasma, a mess, some may say, smears and masses and globules, impressions. Impression, Originally, it was a term Monet used offhandedly to title a painting he made of the docks at Le Havre. It became popularized when critic Louis Leroy used the term to title his less than complimentary review of the first Impressionist exhibition, which took place at 35 Boulevard des Capucines in Paris, April 15th through May 15th, 1874. The show featured 165 artworks by 30 artists rejected by the Paris Salon. The original title, forgive my French here, coming up. The original title of the exhibition was Société Anonyme Coopérative des Artistes Peintres, Sculpteurs et Graveurs, or, in English, Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. As I mentioned, Leroy's review of the exhibition was not particularly kind. The review takes the form of a dialogue between two viewers. Here's an example of an interaction Leroy wrote in response to Monet's Boulevard des Capucines. So I'm quoting his review now. "Aha," he sneered in Mephistophelian manner. "Is that brilliant enough now? There's impression, or I don't know what it means. Only be so good as to tell me what those innumerable black tongue lickings in the lower part of the picture represent." "Why, those are people walking along," I replied. "Then do I look like that when I'm walking along the Boulevard des Capucines? Blood and thunder. So you're making fun of me at last." "I assure you, Monsieur Vincent, but those spots were obtained by the same method as that used to imitate marble. A bit here, a bit there, slapdash in the old way. It's unheard of, appalling. I'll get a stroke from it for sure." End quote. So how do we get here? Where did these impressionists, these refugees, come from? I won't pretend to be able to parse the fabric of history and precisely dictate a definitive genealogy of Impressionism. Like most things in art, and probably most things in life, Impressionism can be considered a confluence, an amalgamation of currents like eddies in a river, which will in turn give way to more eddies and other futures and presents and eventually pasts. That's the way of art and history. However, I can share some of the more identifiable precursors to Impressionism, which in themselves are helpful in illustrating how artists inform artists and art informs art. This is Valley of Aosta, Snowstorm, Avalanche, and Thunderstorm, dated 1836 and 1837, and painted by British artist Joseph Mallard William Turner. It's on view right now here at the Art Institute of Chicago. So 1836-37, that is almost 40 years before the first Impressionist exhibition, the one Leroy had so much fun mocking. And let's talk about what we're seeing. Swirls of color, big gestures, cascades of white and whitish pigment bursting and unfurling in multiple directions, feathery and malevolent at once. A vast C-shaped form looming, starting from the right side of the scene, then stretching to the left and up, and then down again as though it were crashing into something just off the top edge of the canvas. Various browns, reds, grays, implications of sky, suggestions of terrain, nods toward form. At first glance, the image may strike us the way the fruit in Monet's has to some, a mess. Or as Leroy put it, a bit here, a bit there, slapdash in the old way. There's little to ground us, little to help us get oriented so that we can understand exactly what it is we are experiencing. After some time, our eye wanders here to the bottom right, where finally we can rest on something familiar. Figures, people. If you wander up into our galleries, you can get up close and really look. So here I have a close-up for you. How many people? For years, I saw 7. Here, then, one day, I was having a conversation with a group in front of the painting, and I was struck to discover more. Here and here. Infants. I want to look especially at this passage, a person with their arms to the sky, reaching for something. We can't tell what they're looking at. We only know what's chasing them. This person, it appears to be a woman with loose hair and a tight, concerned look on her face. Then this person. Their hands are on their head, their mouth is agape, screaming, moaning, or silent. For us, it's silent. So zooming out again, with some looking, even through the chaos, there is a story, there is drama. there is expression, and that is the part I want to focus on, the expression, the thing that motivated Turner to venture into a style a critic at the time would call, quote, freaks of chromomania. Forms and techniques that would allow him to tell an emotional tale using the unique qualities and potentials of pigment on a surface. In other words, to compromise naturalistic detail for the sake of what he considered truth. A tragic human truth, the truth of terror and of nature as a majestic, merciless force. A naturalistic picture of mountains and storms will not do. Thankfully, Turner found, paint is capable of much more. So this is not a landscape, it's not a life or death situation. This is Bert Morisot's Woman in a Garden from approximately 1882 to 1883. Morisot was one of a small number of female artists who showed with the Impressionists and as an Impressionist. This is a daytime scene, we're outdoors. Morisot is not inventing characters here the way that Turner did. We're looking at real people, people she knew. This was painted in Morisot's family's vacation house along the Seine. It is, on the surface, an uneventful day, painted in an eventful way. Gestures again, action and movement, if slight. Dashes of color, minimal effort to give us the ins and outs of the face, the way that, for example, a John Singer Sargent might have. Often, when I find myself wondering why an artist would make a certain choice, I ask myself, what does it do? In this case, what does it do when Morisot paints in this fragmented, frantic, hectic, seemingly unpolished way? I'll go ahead and think aloud if you'll indulge me. My vision breaks up. I see the picture as a whole, then as a collection of shapes and colors, and then it comes together again. I see the scene, then disappear again into the dashes of flowers, the girl's hat here in the background. And by the way, that girl is believed to be Morisot's daughter. The flowers on this figure's hat, down to her fan, then to the background, leaves maybe, foliage tangled in a fence. The rake, which takes me to this white water of a ground. And again to the fan and the glove, which brings me all the way around again to the flowers. All of it swirling around her blown out face, almost entirely white, like a ghost. But in good humor, I guess, smiling at least a little. Delicate eyebrows, fragile features lost in a blast of sunlight. I can only focus on the essentials here. I can only focus on the moment, a moment which will quickly dissipate into another moment, and then another, and then another. It's as though the picture is moving while I look at it. It won't stay still, like a breeze or like light. Is this what Bert Morisot wanted? This is a print that Edgar Degas made in 1879 of fellow Impressionist Mary Cassatt at the Louvre. They were friends. This is supposedly her sister. Degas, you may recall, is best known for his pastels and paintings of ballet dancers. A common thing among the Impressionists and the Post-impressionists, such as Van Gogh, was an interest in daily life outside of the home and studio, a lifestyle and personality identified by Baudelaire as the flaneur. Baudelaire writes of the flaneur, "The crowd is his domain, as the air is that of the birds, and the water the fishes. His passion and profession is to espouse the crowd. For the perfect flaneur or saunterer, for the passionate observer, it is an immense joy to take up one's dwelling among the multitude, amidst undulation, movement, the fugitive, the infinite, to be absent from home and yet feel oneself everywhere at home. To view the world, to be at the heart of the world, and yet hidden from the world. Such are some of the least pleasures of those independent spirits, passionate and impartial, that language can only inadequately define. The spectator is a prince who rejoices everywhere in his incognito. The crowd is his domain, his passion. The spectator is a prince who rejoices everywhere in his incognito. The male pronoun is no oversight, but to give Baudelaire some credit, it was no kind of sight at all, just a default. The flaneur was male. The artist was and should be a flaneur. Therefore, the artist was and should be male. They had to be male because a woman shouldn't be wandering around being at the heart of the world, except to the extent that the home is the heart of the world. And an artist must see the world in order to capture it and tell about it in paint. So then what of artists like Morisot and Marie Cassatt? What are their solutions? This is The Child's Bath from 1893 by Cassatt. A young woman bathes a child's feet in a bowl of water. They look down, eyes cast upon the gentle pressing by the woman's fingers of the girl's foot. It's an image of patterns, and it's an image of bodies. The woman's body, the woman's hands, holding the girl's foot and wrapped around the girl's waist, holding her in place to keep her from falling, existing as the stabilizing presence, a large form in the context of the composition, centering, and even a little overwhelming. But more so, the little girl's body. She is pink and white and gray. She glows. Her knees are bright knobs. Her shins reflect the light. Her chest and stomach are smooth and rounded, cherubic. Pink cheeks, dark, sheening hair. The patterns are everywhere. The woman's striped dress in relatively muted tones, the orange rug with diamonds and florals, the wallpaper behind them, the furniture, the picture cut off in the foreground, white and painted with another floral pattern. There are elements here that we might call painterly in an impressionist way, like the brushstrokes in the Morisot or the Monet, or the Turner for that matter, especially in the background. But in general, the forms that make the central figures are clearly delineated, firmly articulated by shades of blue, bright orange, brown, and others. Around the edges of the fabric, where skin meets skin, where skin meets fabric or water. This is not the muddle of Monet's grapes, so what makes it impressionist? It's important to realize that the artists we call impressionists have multiple things in common, but they also have things that make them different from one another, as we have seen. The Impressionists almost always featured scenes from everyday life. This is the Seine at Port Marly Palace of Sand, painted by Alfred Sisley in 1875. It's an image of men dredging sand from the river, a more or less mundane scene. It's as though a Chicago impressionist were to paint an image of construction on the Dan Ryan. Potholes being filled or tar being poured, but Sisley didn't paint a boring picture. He chose a typical scene and elevated it, taking these scenes from daily life and using a medium, paint on canvas, to shift the way we perceive them, to ask us to look closer at the moments and actions that make up our world. It isn't only the actions taking place either, it's also the movement and color of the water, the skies, the shadows, the trees and hills in the distance. So I want to go back to Mary Cassatt. She was an impressionist for several reasons. She did exhibit with the Impressionists and thus was labeled an impressionist from the beginning. She was also inspired by the technique of Japanisme, the ukiyo-e woodblock printing technique that had been practiced in Japan for centuries. In The Child's Bath, Cassatt deploys a visual style that is reminiscent of a Japanese print. You can see an example here. Slightly different subject matter, but similar styles. Pattern meets pattern. The patterns flood into one another, but they are distinct, like a river converging with the sea. So the painting's composition is layered, and the girl begins to look as though she might slide right off the picture plane. The Impressionists generally were inspired by Japanese prints, as was Van Gogh. They collected them, they copied them, and they made their own images in the same spirit. The third aspect of Cassatt's painting that connects her with the other Impressionists is this fascination with the known. Paris streets, factories, fields, familiar rivers, and familiar faces. While the other artists could be flaneurs and go where they pleased, for the most part, Cassatt and Morisot were unable to do so. They had to go where women went, the theater maybe, or a quiet garden. And in this case, Cassatt has selected a domestic interior, a subject matter that she returned to many times. It was, after all, one of the only spaces she could be free to work in. But like the other Impressionists, and one may say even more than most of the other Impressionists, she elevated her subject matter by painting it. A mother and child had traditionally been depicted in painting in the guise of the Virgin and Christ. That religious content was suitable for respectable art. But what of this mother and child, if that is the relationship, at home? They matter. They matter to Cassatt, and she wants them to matter to us as well. I said that most of the Impressionists focused on daily life rather than the mythical, religious, or historical subject matter that tended to make up most painting that mattered before this time. And I want to show a possible exception. Eduard Manet painted Jesus mocked by the soldiers in 1865. Technically, Manet was not an Impressionist, but I think that is illustrative because it reminds us once again that the Impressionists were not the monolithic and easy to categorize collective that we often assume they were, like the Pink Ladies in Greece or the Hells Angels. No, circumstances were much more interesting than that. Manet was a supporter and friend of the Impressionists, but he did not exhibit with them. He was older than many of the Impressionists and more established. They gathered around him, literally, as you can see in this painting by Henri Fontaine-Latour, which includes likenesses of Manet, Auguste Renoir, the author Émile Zola, and Claude Monet. So in this painting, Christ is pretty easy to identify. He's got the beard, he's got the crown of thorns, he's looking up at the sky as if beckoning his Father, the Lord, or as though he is searching for the grace to endure what he is experiencing. This scene reflects a paragraph in the Bible in which Christ is taken prisoner, then tormented by Roman soldiers, from Matthew 27:27 of the King James Bible. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe. And when they had plaited a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him on the head. And after that they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him and led him away to crucify him. If you've seen this painting in person, you know it's of relatively large scale. This is another traditional approach to a religious subject. So for all intents and purposes, this painting does check off multiple of the requirements of being considered, quote, serious artwork by critics of the time. But things start to go awry when we look a bit closer. We can start with the Roman soldiers. I'm guessing you've seen images of Roman soldiers in paintings and movies and such. I picked this example from our collection, more or less at random. This is a Roman soldier. We can identify him because he's the only one wearing head-to-toe armor, because he's a soldier. So going back to the Manet again. Now, I don't know about these guys. This fellow looks like he's wearing Renaissance streetwear. He's dressed like a Robin Hood or something. This guy at least has a helmet, but otherwise he's something of a hodgepodge, all shirtless and all. Then there's this gentleman holding the scarlet robe and staring open-mouthed out of the scene. He's wearing a furry cape and what I'm going to call a bright orange or yellow do-rag. He also happens to be barefoot. I don't think the Roman army was known for individualism or for disorganization, but even if it were, I have a hard time believing any of these guys could possibly be Roman soldiers. So Manet lived and died in Paris, so he had ready access to the Louvre, where no doubt he would have seen historic examples of Roman soldiers, or really any kind of soldier anywhere. So I think we should take him at his word. This was an intentional choice. Like many artists, Manet used models for his paintings. The person who sat as the model for Jesus in this painting was Manet's locksmith. Hard to say whether he looks more like Jesus or a locksmith here, but we can state that critics at the time were not fans of Manet's interpretation. Christ was supposed to be a holy, powerful symbol of faith and sacrifice. This 1632 painting by Diego Velázquez is a good example, so let's look at them side by side. We should point out first off the fact that they are different scenes in Christ's story. Manet's is from just before the crucifixion, Velázquez's is during the crucifixion, a major distinction. And I want to look especially at the body types of the two figures. Manet was criticized for making the Jesus in his painting so pale and flimsy, boneless and weak. The Christ in Velázquez's painting may be vulnerable, but he is not weak. He is thin, but he is muscular. He has definition and dignity. He has strength. On top of this, he has a halo, whereas the Christ in Manet's painting does not. It was not beyond the pale for a depiction of Christ to go unhaloed, though it is less common. However, the lack of a halo, the awkwardness of the body, even the redness of the beard give us pause. This, combined with the incongruous soldiers, points to the biggest innovation of all, and the biggest insult, if you were among Manet's many critics, which is his decision to put aside traditional artifice altogether. One cartoonist made an illustration of this painting by parodying it as a man getting a foot bath. The caption reads, 4 employees of the large sewer collector propose to give a foot bath to a rag picker friend who's never had one. What if Manet chose to bring his models to the studio, have them select a costume and props, and then pose in front of a black background, as though they were being photographed? We end up with an image of Christ that is self-aware of its own artificiality. It knows that it's a painting, that it is not the real thing. It says, Christ was a man, or what if Christ was a man just like us, or what if I am like Christ? The soldier on the right side of the painting looks out at us. It's difficult to categorize his expression. The closest thing I can think of is maybe surprise. Maybe he's been caught mid-action, caught doing something he's not supposed to be doing. He sees us as though we have just walked into the room. Maybe he's caught himself. Manet took a risk, giving his viewers their own reality in painting. Their contemporaries, people just like them, this was not what the salon viewers wanted from their art. They wanted wonder. They wanted majesty. They wanted mystery and illusion. They liked the artifice. The real world didn't have enough artifice, really. The real world is ugly and chaotic. Artists are supposed to beautify. They're supposed to sing. Manet isn't beautifying anything here. If anything, he's uglifying. He's squawking. People hated Manet's artwork so much that they would attempt to physically destroy it when it was on view. But he was among those laying the groundwork for the rest of the Impressionists, telling them that they could look at their own lives to make their art, that the modern Paris and the modern world were important enough to capture in color, important enough to be art. This is modern Paris. Gustave Caillebotte painted Paris Street Rainy Day in 1877. The streets, expanded by Georges-Eugène Haussmann and Napoleon III, had transformed Paris from a medieval city into a modern metropolis composed of wide boulevards and spacious parks. The old Paris was gone forever. Not everyone was pleased by this. One 20th century historian said Haussmann's work had done, quote, more damage to the city than 100 bombings, end quote. Caillebotte regularly turned his attention to the architecture and people of a new Paris, their dress, their behaviors, their relationships. I began this conversation with a photograph, and I want to come back to photography for just a moment because this painting in particular has much to do with it. Caillebotte is believed to have used a camera lucida to make Paris Street Rainy Day. The camera lucida was a portable instrument that used reflective surfaces to allow an artist to trace a subject with a precision impossible to achieve with the naked eye. I don't want to go out too far on a limb, but there are parallels to be made with our 21st century obsession with artificial intelligence and the questions we ask about where AI should and should not intervene. And in any event, Caillebotte likely used the camera lucida and pinpointed the angles of this intersection, which still exists, though in fact he did apply some distortion, like a special effect, in order to level out the angles that actually characterize this location so that Paris Street Rainy Day turns out to be hyperreal as opposed to merely real. It's a heightened reality. It is more than we asked for, but it is the truth. Claude Monet, who lived from 1840 to 1926, that is, through several revolutions in the trajectory of painting, used to set up multiple canvases at a location and run from one to the next, updating as he went to ensure he would not miss a moment of the light. Painting en plein air, or outdoors, was another impressionist tendency. For centuries, painters had to grind their own pigments and mix their own paint, but in the 19th century, portable tubes of paint became available, and suddenly it was much easier to go outside with your canvas and brushes and get some work done. I think it was pretty punk rock of them. Grab your stuff and go, like the Ramones carrying their guitars on the New York subway to get to a gig. This is an example of one of Monet's stacks of wheat paintings, in this case, Stacks of Wheat, End of Summer, painted in 1890. He painted approximately 30 of these, several of which are on view here at the Art Institute. Monet painted many series over the course of his career. In addition to the Stacks of Wheat, he painted almost 100 views of the River Thames in London. And perhaps most famously, his garden and water lilies were favorites that he returned to again and again for decades. Monet may be considered by some as the preeminent impressionist. He was, after all, the artist who initially deployed the term impression to name one of his paintings during the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. His fascination with capturing and rendering light would seem to beg that terminology. The word impression has a fleeting, ephemeral quality to it, even a longing or a ghost of a memory, something there but not completely. On top of all this, Monet lived for a long time, well into the 20th century, and into the period when the Impressionists could be lauded as precursors to modern avant-garde art movements and collected in some of the most important museums in the world, including the Art Institute. He was also remarkably consistent in his approach. The different stages of his career can be distinguished more effectively by subject matter rather than style. This water lily painting was made near the end of Monet's life, around 1917, in the heat of World War I, when bombs exploding along the Western Front were close enough to Monet's home in Giverny for him to hear them as he worked. It was also painted during a time when Monet was suffering from intense cataracts. His eyesight degenerated for 10 years as he refused to receive treatment until he said he could no longer really see the difference between one color on his palette and another. He said the only way he could identify a color was by using the label on the paint tube. I want to read a short poem that a colleague shared with me. It's titled, "Monet Refuses the Operation." It was written by Liselle Mueller and published in 1996. Monet refuses the operation. "Doctor, you say there are no halos around the streetlights in Paris, and what I see is an aberration caused by old age and affliction. I tell you, it has taken me all my life to arrive at the vision of gas lamps as angels, to soften and blur and finally banish the edges you regret I don't see, to learn that the line I call the horizon does not exist, and sky and water, so long apart, are the same state of being. 54 years before I could see, Rouen Cathedral is built of parallel shafts of sun, and now you want to restore my youthful errors, fixed notions of top and bottom, the illusion of three-dimensional space, wisteria separate from the bridge it covers. What can I say to convince you the Houses of Parliament dissolve night after night to become the fluid dream of the Thames? I will not return to a universe of objects that don't know each other, as if islands were not the lost children of one great continent. The world is flux, and light becomes what it touches, becomes water, lilies on water, above and below water, becomes lilac and mauve and yellow and white and cerulean lamps, small fists passing sunlight so quickly to one another that it would take long, streaming hair inside my brush to catch it, to paint the speed of light. Our weighted shapes, these verticals, burn to mix with air and change our bones, skin, clothes to gases. Doctor, if only you could see how heaven pulls earth into its arms and how infinitely the heart expands to claim this world, blue vapor without end." Finally, Monet decided that he would undergo cataract surgery, and suddenly he was able to see more clearly than he had in years. Seeing the paintings he had done while his eyesight was at its worst, he grew despondent and destroyed them. But he did not destroy this one. We can compare this painting made during the Great War, the previous one, with this painting of the water lily pond made in 1906. One is composed of brilliant hues of emerald green and bright blues. The later painting is mostly muddy greens and browns. It could be a different pond altogether. I don't want to entirely strike up the differences in these two paintings of the cataracts because I have not seen that explicitly described in my research. However, the dates align, as does the story, and the differences in the paintings match the descriptions left about the impact the cataracts had on Monet. It is clear that Monet preferred the pre- and post-cataract paintings to the muddier works he made while his eyesight was suffering. That said, it seems a shame to me that Monet would have destroyed most of the canvases he painted during that time. For an artist long gone and deeply admired, each work is precious. Even if he did not see value in those paintings, we might, as with this one. The colors are muted, dingy, squalid. Because the painting does not possess the dazzling jewel-like brightness of Monet's most famous works, I have to find something else to pursue and admire. Maybe it's the swirls and patches of yellows and browns at the bottom right of the image, or the cottonish tufts of green swirling in the muted velvet water at the painting's center. I want to see the painting also as a reflection of the war, death and mechanical destruction the likes of which had never been seen, steel, mustard gas creeping across open fields, bug-eyed masks. Monet is painting within earshot. How could he not be influenced? How could the decimation not enter his gesture despite the minimal eyesight? Because of the minimal eyesight, allowing him to tap into a conceptual truth that brought the modern world and the history of art into the single person of Monet, who would die only a few years later. It isn't just a painting, it's a form. It's a sculpture in three-dimensional space, a sculpture of an idea, the idea of a pond, the idea of millions of deaths beyond the horizon but within hearing, the idea of a man near the end of his life attempting to find hope. So I say too much, and I see what I see, and all along it was the truth that Monet was searching for, that all of the Impressionists were searching for. Even reality cannot capture the truth. Monet's stacks of wheat don't look like stacks of wheat. His bridges do not look like bridges. They are impressions because an impression is all they could be and still be authentic, still be true. The truth. This is Van Gogh's bedroom. Here was another artist who wanted to tell a truth, who was compelled to the truth. He didn't know how to do it any other way. He didn't have the tools to censor himself. The truth had to be told in a language beyond data or plain autobiography. The room is distorted, elongated, off-kilter. The colors, especially the green in the floorboards, speak of a sickness far worse than Monet's cataracts. Van Gogh spent the last years of his life in a mental hospital, bringing his hallucinogenic approach to color and form to a new canvas every day at a frenzied pace. It is difficult to believe Van Gogh's work would have been possible without the Impressionists who came before him. This self-portrait in the Art Institute's collection has some of the telltale signs of Impressionism, but it also has something darker, if you want to call it that. I think it's in the eyes. The green eyes rimmed with pink. One eye is slightly more precise and glowing than the other. It may be in the brighter green touches. It may be in these two strokes of orange. Why are they there, and what do they indicate? I start to wonder what Van Gogh was thinking as he painted his own eyes. And did you know there are only 2 known photographs of Van Gogh? There is an alertness about the eyes, as though he's suspicious of something, or sees something just off the canvas that he's afraid of. I wonder if he had to make this expression in order to recreate it, or if it was an expression he had all the time. And if it was an expression he had to act out, did he do it because he knew he was often afraid of something and he wanted to make an impression of his own fear? These apples were painted by Paul Cézanne in 1893, 3 years after Van Gogh's death. Both Cézanne and Van Gogh were considered post-impressionists. When you have the opportunity, go see this painting in our galleries. Cézanne's apples are more real than real apples. Cassat's children are more real than real children. Van Gogh's pain is more real than real pain. It's more true. It is a magnificent feat to distort a reality into trueness, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you. So we have a few minutes for if anybody has questions or comments. We have a couple of staff with microphones, so you can, I think, raise your hand, and they'll come and try to find you. No pressure. There have been a couple of instances where photos of Van Gogh's brother Theo were mistaken for images of him. But as far as we're aware, these are the only 2 confirmed Van Gogh photographs.
Sir, was there any significance to the difference in color of the skins on the Jesus painting?
The question was whether there was significance to the different color of the skins in the Jesus painting. If this was a more intimate conversation, say at dinner, I would say, well, what do you think? But it's hard to do that in this situation. I touched on it a little bit when we were talking about it, but I think it would depend on how you read that skin tone difference. So with the one that Manet did, most people read that as being a pretty pale, the word that often comes to mind for me is salamanderish kind of skin. It's not a particularly healthy pallor, whereas with the Velázquez and with a lot of other images of Christ, you see something healthier, maybe more consistent, less washed out. So if it's a choice that Manet is making in order to bring the Christ in his painting a little closer to relatability, then that may be one way to read it, but there are certainly other ways to read it as well.
Hey, this is a little off your topic, so you may not really know the answer to this one, but I'm just curious because I'm thinking about the way this whole emphasis on just basically spots of color, basically the impressionist thing, it was kind of a response to photography. I'm wondering if the kind of like cubism and Cézanne's structure, like two-dimensional structure on the picture plane, and all that sort of drawing stuff that came a little later, I'm wondering if that was a response to maybe color coming into photography or something. I don't know the history of photography or any of that, so I'm a little, I'm just asking the question.
It's a great question. I think that what I've seen in researching a lot of the artists and researching photography in general, including color photography, is that there wasn't necessarily a big response by painters to the innovation of adding color to photography. I think that people, at least in the West, in Europe and America especially, it seems like it was sort of understood that painters had more access to inventive ways of using color than photographers did, just because they just could, and there was a long history of being able to use color, whereas photography was much better at capturing a precise version of reality that we would recognize. So a lot of the Impressionists were, I'm glad you're mentioning, color, and then Cézanne and how, they thought about color as this really kind of vibrant, mysterious, but also scientific way of altering the way that people could see. A lot of the Impressionists talk about how much they loved Eugène Delacroix, who was a French painter working earlier in the 19th century, and they were astounded by the way that he could put one color next to the other one and make both of them pop in really dramatic, exciting ways. And that was the kind of thing that they were really into and wanted to take farther. So if you think about Seurat, for example, in our famous painting here, Sunday in the Isle of La Grande Jatte. La Grande Jatte is pointillism, and it's the same concept, but taking it even farther, where you put different pigments next to each other and it creates something new. And photography just couldn't do that. Even when it started to, they used to just, their version of colorizing photography sometimes was to take the final photo and just color it in, and that didn't look so cool. It's kind of just, that didn't look so great. So I think the painters were looking to other painters to be inspired by color.
Hi. In the self-portrait from Van Gogh, do you have any thoughts about why he might have used orange? Because I guess if we look at older paintings, maybe Renaissance paintings where red could be a symbolization for passion, do you have any thoughts on why he used orange instead of, say, a white or a red or blue?
Yeah, I think one of the, I think that's a question that really kind of goes to the heart of enjoying Van Gogh and trying to understand him is how could he possibly see these colors as part of his reality? So if he's looking at an image of himself and just trying to paint himself, why would he choose these colors? Or if he's looking at a field or a sky, where does that desire or that compulsion come from to bring these surreal colors into that space? And unlike earlier painters, much earlier painters who, they might use the color blue or something and say, well, blue means this. I think someone like Van Gogh, if you were to ask him, why'd you use orange, he probably would give you a long speech about it, but I doubt that he would say, he might say orange means this, but also it can mean this and it can mean this. And he wrote a lot about his painting, especially in letters to his brother. And he would speculate and talk about the impact of different types of colors, but it was more him just thinking out loud and less about him saying the orange means this. So I think one of the exciting things about looking at a painting like this one, or that minute detail that I chose to focus on, the orange around his eye, it's exciting and and kind of an adventure, a visual adventure, to try to understand what he might have been thinking to do that. And then it makes us see differently as well.
Hi, thank you for the talk. A question speaking to the reality of the portrayal of the Christ figure. Did any Impressionists depict him as he really was, as more Semitic and dark, or was that just too radical?
That's a great question, and no, not that I'm aware of. The Impressionists in general didn't. This is why, Manet was kind of that particular painting was sort of was off the grid a little in terms of classic Impressionism, because they very rarely made images. The people we consider Impressionists who exhibited together almost never made images of religious figures or mythological figures like Christ. I'm sure that somebody, like if you dug into the research, you could probably find some examples, but I honestly can't think of a single one offhand. So I don't know why they wouldn't choose to do more of what Manet did. But one thing that comes to mind is that Manet really got a lot of pushback. People hated, like I said, they hated his paintings, that painting and some others that he did. And so they might have just been like, I don't want to completely destroy my career, and so I'll just stay away from Christian subject matter and focus on like a picture of a cafe or something instead. But most of also what they were interested in is, they just were interested in elevating their daily life, and so that's just what they really chose to focus on.
We have time for one more question.
I know you're primarily talking about color, but I can't help but notice, especially with Degas, but it's true of some of the other Impressionists, they really did funny things with composition and the angle of their photographs. I noticed the one that you put up, one of the figures is chopped off on the one side and the other figures are sort of stuck in the corner, and there's a tremendous amount of ground. I wouldn't think your in comparison with this, which is beautifully, sort of framed, was that just an attempt to be different and unique, or what do you think was going on there?
Yeah, I think there's different ways to think about that. One is, there's two different ways of looking at that. One is with the Cézanne type of example, which I think, if you look at a lot of Cézanne's paintings, I especially see it in his still lifes, the angles are kind of all over the place and not terribly realistic. So there's these explorations of color, but then with Cézanne especially, and this is one of the reasons Cézanne is like a precursor to Cubism and things like that, is he was really messing with the space and how can painting say something unique about the way we experience space? So, like these apples and things almost look like they could just roll down off of here, like what exactly is going on in terms of the angles and stuff. So that was something that he was just interested in, is like the illusion of space and paint, because, I'm repeating myself maybe, but painters have the opportunity to explore things in ways that cameras can't, or the ways that our eyes can't. And one of the things that Cézanne at least was excited by was thinking about how space worked. In terms of people being cut off, I think a really good example is that Paris Street Rainy Day, where there's a figure off to the right who's being cut off. But there's a lot of different examples. And people, there's maybe different ways to think about that, but the one that I think I see the most often is the comparison, again, to photography, which is, the idea that a photograph can take a different kind of picture that's less perfectly composed. It's more like what you might expect from a snapshot. And later in the 19th century, cameras were, early on said that photo took about 8 hours to develop, but later in the 19th century, it was down to a few seconds. And the technology was moving pretty quick. And so you would have compositions where people are cut off and things like that. So, there may be some reference to that, but also the way that it gives it a different kind of dynamic action if somebody's cut off. So I think it's maybe some of those questions or why you might see some of that in these paintings. Well, I think that was our last one. Thank you all again for coming along. Have a great night. And thanks for coming.